The executive elevator's silence felt suffocating as Grayson Hale watched the numbers climb to the 42nd floor. His reflection stared back from the polished steel doors, sharp jawline, designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and eyes that had grown cold from years of viewing everything through profit margins. At 36, he owned what others could only dream of. His supermarket chain, Hale Foods, stretched across 38 states with over 2,000 locations. Yet standing in that golden cage of success, he felt something gnawing at his chest, a hollow ache he couldn't name. The doors slid open to reveal his corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Columbus. But today, the sight made his stomach turn. Down below, tiny figures hurried along sidewalks, rushing to jobs that barely paid their bills, while he sat in his ivory tower, completely disconnected from their reality. "Mr. Hale?" His assistant's voice cut through his thoughts. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Grayson nodded without looking away from the window. Somewhere down there, in one of his stores, real people were struggling. The thought had been haunting him ever since the viral TikTok videos started flooding social media 3 weeks ago. Silent tears of retail had become a battle cry for retail workers sharing horror stories about his company. "They cut our hours but expect the same productivity. I haven't had a real lunch break in months. The managers treat us like we're disposable." Each video felt like a punch to his gut. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were human beings, and he didn't even know their names. The boardroom buzzed with familiar voices discussing quarterly reports and expansion plans. Grayson took his seat at the head of the mahogany table, surrounded by executives who spoke his language, the cold, calculated language of business. "Sir, about the negative publicity," his marketing director began, sliding a tablet across the table. "We've prepared a statement." "No." Grayson's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I want to see it for myself." "Sir, I'm going undercover. Pick a location, somewhere these complaints are coming from. I want to work on the floor as a regular employee." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. His CFO leaned forward, brow furrowed. "Grayson, that's incredibly risky. If anyone recognizes you, they won't." His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. "I'll be just another trainee. No one looks twice at the new guy." That evening, alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Grayson stared at his reflection again. This time, he saw something different, a flicker of purpose in eyes that had been empty for too long. Tomorrow, he would trade his Armani suits for a polyester uniform. He would clock in at minimum wage and discover what it really meant to work for Grayson Hale. He had built an empire, but he was about to learn that empires mean nothing when they're built on the suffering of the invisible. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as Grayson stepped through the employee entrance of Hale Foods store number 847 in Dayton, Ohio. His hands felt foreign in the cheap polyester uniform, navy blue polo with the company logo he'd designed years ago, now feeling like a costume that didn't quite fit. "You must be Gary." A heavyset man with tired eyes extended his hand. "I'm Rick, assistant manager. Welcome to the jungle." Gary. The fake name tasted bitter on his tongue. Grayson had chosen it to stay close to his real identity, but standing here, surrounded by time clocks and motivational posters about team spirit, he felt like he was betraying everyone in the room. "First day?" Rick continued, not waiting for an answer. "Hope you brought comfortable shoes. We'll start you on cart duty, then move you to stocking if you survive the morning rush." The morning rush. Grayson had seen the numbers, peak hours between 7 and 10 a.m., but he'd never witnessed the chaos firsthand. Within minutes, the parking lot transformed into a battlefield of honking cars and frustrated customers, while he pushed heavy metal carts under the scorching Ohio sun. His designer watch, hastily replaced with a $20 digital one, showed 8:47 a.m. when sweat began pooling beneath his shirt collar. By 9:15, his lower back screamed in protest. At 9:30, he understood why the employee turnover rate in this position was 87%. "Pick up the pace, newbie." A voice cut through his exhaustion. Grayson looked up to see a woman in her late 20s leaning against the store's entrance, arms crossed. Auburn hair escaped from a messy bun, framing a face that was equal parts beautiful and weary. Her name tag read Ellie Brooks, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Deep green, like forest shadows, holding secrets he suddenly wanted to uncover. "The carts don't move themselves," she continued, but her tone softened slightly. "And customers get nasty when they can't find one." "Right. Sorry." Grayson wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of grime on his sleeve. Ellie studied him for a moment longer than necessary. You look like you've never done manual labor in your life. If only you knew. I'm a quick learner. We'll see. She turned to head back inside, then paused. Word of advice? Don't let Rick see you struggling, or you'll be out by lunch. And wear gloves tomorrow. Your hands are already bleeding. Grayson looked down at his palms, surprised to see thin red lines where the metal cart handles had cut into his soft skin. When he looked up, Ellie was gone, disappeared into the store like a ghost. The rest of the morning blurred into a symphony of aching muscles and harsh reality. By noon, when Rick finally called for his break, Grayson understood something that no boardroom meeting had ever taught him. Survival in this world required more than intelligence or ambition. It required something he'd forgotten he possessed: humility. As he sat in the cramped break room, eating a bologna sandwich he'd grabbed from the deli, Grayson caught his reflection in the microwave door. The man staring back looked different, hair disheveled, face flushed, uniform wrinkled with honest sweat. For the first time in years, he looked real. 3 days into his undercover assignment, Grayson had learned to navigate the unspoken hierarchy of store number 847. The morning crew barely acknowledged the afternoon shift. Rick ruled with passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes. And everyone, absolutely everyone, walked carefully around the store manager, Vincent Torres, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. But it was Ellie who fascinated him most. She moved through her workstation like a dancer who'd forgotten the music, each motion efficient yet somehow graceful. Customers lined up specifically for her register, drawn by something Grayson couldn't quite identify. She wasn't particularly chatty, didn't flash the forced smiles corporate trained them to wear. Instead, she offered something rarer: genuine attention. "How's Mrs. Chen doing?" she asked an elderly woman buying cat food and frozen dinners. "Oh, Ellie dear, she's much better. Thank you for asking about her surgery." Grayson, restocking shelves nearby, felt something twist in his chest. Mrs. Chen. Ellie knew her customer's name, her story. Meanwhile, he'd built a billion-dollar empire without knowing a single employee's middle name. "Hey, Gary!" Rick's voice boomed across the store. "Stop daydreaming and help Vincent with the inventory audit." The back office reeked of stale coffee and broken dreams. Vincent sat hunched over spreadsheets, his fingers dancing across a calculator that looked older than Grayson's car. "Corporate's breathing down my neck again," Vincent muttered without looking up. "They want me to cut another 15 hours from the schedule this week." Grayson's blood ran cold. 15 hours meant someone would lose nearly half their paycheck. Which shifts? Probably night crew. They're expendable. Vincent's casual cruelty hung in the air like smoke. Speaking of which, that Brooks girl's been here too long. People get comfortable, start thinking they deserve things. Ellie? The name escaped before Grayson could stop it. Vincent's eyes narrowed. "You know her?" She seems like a good worker." "Good workers are a dime a dozen. Cheap workers are gold." Vincent leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously. "She's been asking about her health insurance again. Pain in my ass. Maybe it's time for a performance review." The words hit Grayson like physical blows. This was his company, his policies, his culture of treating people like disposable inventory. He wanted to grab Vincent by the collar, to scream that Ellie deserved better, that they all did. Instead, he nodded and mumbled something about understanding business priorities. That evening, as closing time approached, Grayson watched Ellie methodically clean her register. Her movements had grown slower throughout the day, exhaustion settling into her shoulders like snow on winter branches. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and twice he'd caught her steadying herself against the counter. "You okay?" he found himself asking as she counted her till. She looked up, startled. "What? You seem tired." For a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped. He glimpsed something raw underneath: fear, desperation, the kind of bone-deep weariness that sleep couldn't cure. "I'm fine." The mask snapped back into place. "Just been a long day." But as she walked toward the break room to clock out, Grayson noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way she pressed them against her stomach as if trying to hold something together. Something was very wrong, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to follow. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. In this sterile corporate environment he'd created, real human suffering was happening right under his nose. And for the first time in his privileged life, Grayson Hale felt truly helpless. The store felt different after closing, hollow and haunted, like a theater after the last curtain call. Most employees had rushed out the moment their shifts ended, eager to escape to whatever waited for them in the real world. But Grayson lingered, something pulling him deeper into the maze of darkened aisles. He told himself he was just doing his job, checking that everything was properly stocked for tomorrow's opening. But his feet carried him toward the back of the store, past the dairy section, past the frozen foods, until he heard it, a sound that made his chest tighten. Soft crying, muffled but unmistakable. Following the sound, he found himself in the storage area behind aisle 7, where towers of cereal boxes created a makeshift fortress. And there, crumpled on the cold linoleum floor with her knees drawn to her chest, was Ellie. Her auburn hair had escaped its bun completely, cascading around her face like a waterfall of copper. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and in the harsh fluorescent light, she looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way that broke something fundamental inside him. Ellie. His voice came out rougher than intended. She jerked upright, wiping her face frantically. Gary, I didn't know anyone was still here. Are you okay? She attempted a laugh that sounded more like glass breaking. Just peachy. Living the dream, you know? Grayson sat down beside her on the floor, not caring about his uniform or dignity. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, the way her hands trembled as she tried to compose herself. What's wrong? He asked quietly. For a long moment, she just stared at the wall of Lucky Charms boxes. Then, as if a dam had burst inside her, the words came pouring out. My mom has COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Her voice cracked on the medical terms. She needs oxygen therapy every night, sometimes during the day too. The machine, the tanks, the medications. It's expensive, really expensive. Grayson felt his heart sinking into his stomach. I've been working here for 3 years. 3 years of perfect attendance, never missing a shift, picking up extra hours whenever they needed me. And last week, she laughed bitterly. They cut my health insurance, said I wasn't working enough hours to qualify anymore, even though they're the ones who reduced my schedule. The words hit him like bullets. They. She was talking about his company, his policies, his decisions. I make $11 an hour, Gary. $11. And they want me to pay $800 a month for insurance I might not even be able to use because the deductible is so high. Tears streamed down her cheeks unchecked now. My mom can't breathe without that oxygen. She literally can't breathe. And I don't know what I'm going to do. She buried her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. I can't let her die because I can't afford to keep her alive. But I also can't quit because then we'd have nothing at all. I'm trapped, Gary. Completely and utterly trapped. Grayson sat frozen, her words echoing in his head like accusations. Every sob felt like a judgment on his life, his choices, his willful blindness to the human cost of his business model. And the worst part? Ellie's voice dropped to a whisper. I have to smile every day. Clock in, smile at customers, pretend everything's fine while my whole world is falling apart. Because if they think I'm not positive enough, they'll find a reason to let me go. In that moment, surrounded by breakfast cereals and broken dreams, Grayson Hale finally understood what it meant to be invisible. Grayson couldn't sleep. For 3 nights straight, he'd lain in his king-sized bed in his downtown penthouse, staring at the ceiling while Ellie's words echoed in his mind. My mom can't breathe without that oxygen. She literally can't breathe. He'd built his fortune on efficiency, on cutting costs and maximizing profits. But now, those numbers had a face. They had auburn hair and green eyes filled with desperation. By Thursday morning, he'd made a decision that would have horrified his board of directors. I need to see the employee files for store new 847, he told his assistant over the phone, careful to use his secure line. Sir, is there a problem with the location? Just send them, encrypted. And I want details on the health insurance policies for part-time employees. The files arrived within an hour. Ellie Brooks, employee ID, Berber 4829. 3 years of perfect attendance records, glowing customer service reviews, and then, buried in the fine print of her benefits package, the corporate knife that had been slowly twisting in her back. Hours reduced from 35 to 28 per week as of last month. Health insurance eligibility, 30+ hours required. Grayson closed his laptop with trembling hands. 7 hours. Her life was being destroyed over 7 hours of work per week. That afternoon, he returned to store number 847 with a plan forming in his mind. He couldn't reveal his identity, not yet, but he could find other ways to help. Hey, Ellie. He approached her register during a brief lull in customers. I was wondering, do you know anything about those assistance programs? You know, for people with medical bills? She looked up sharply, wariness flickering across her features. Why? He scrambled for a believable story. My sister's been struggling with some health issues. Money's tight. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. There are a few programs, but most have waiting lists miles long. And the paperwork? She shook her head. It's designed to make you give up before you even start. What about emergency funds? Doesn't the company have something? Ellie's laugh was hollow. You're new here, aren't you? This place would charge us for the air we breathe if they could figure out how to meter it. That evening, Grayson made a call that would change everything. I need you to set up a charitable fund, he told his lawyer. Anonymous, for medical emergencies. I want it to look like it comes from a local foundation. How much are we talking about, Grayson? Start with $50,000, and I want the first recipient to be someone named Eleanor Brooks in Dayton, Ohio. The next day, he watched Ellie from across the store, noting the same exhaustion in her movements, the same careful way she held herself together. During his lunch break, he made another call. Vincent Torres? This is corporate HR. We've received a complaint about scheduling irregularities at your location. Effective immediately, Eleanor Brooks is to be restored to full-time status. But sir, the budget has been adjusted. Make it happen. When he returned from lunch, he found Ellie standing by the employee bulletin board, staring at a notice that had been posted there. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she might collapse. Ellie? He approached carefully. Everything okay? She turned to him, and he was shocked to see tears streaming down her face. But this time, they weren't tears of desperation. They were tears of disbelief, of hope, of something that looked dangerously like joy. Someone. She struggled to find words. There's a fund. A medical assistance fund I'd never heard of. They're covering my mom's oxygen therapy for the next 6 months. And my schedule. They're giving me back my full-time hours. She looked at him with those devastating green eyes, and Grayson felt his carefully constructed world shifting on its axis. Gary, I know this sounds crazy, but do you believe in miracles? Standing there in his polyester uniform, surrounded by the lies he'd built his life on, Grayson realized he was starting to believe in something far more dangerous than miracles. He was starting to believe in love. 2 weeks had passed since the miracle, and something had shifted between Grayson and Ellie. It started with small things. Shared glances across the store, her saving him a seat during break, the way she'd started calling him by name instead of just, hey, new guy. It was during one of these quiet moments, sitting in the cramped break room with vending machine coffee that tasted like liquid cardboard, that Ellie began to let her guard down. You know what's funny? She said, stirring sugar into her cup with a plastic spoon. I used to have dreams. Real ones, not just surviving until tomorrow. What kind of dreams? Grayson found himself genuinely curious about this woman who could make minimum wage feel like dignity. I wanted to be a nurse. Her smile was soft, tinged with old sadness. Had 2 years of college before Mom got sick. Pre-med track, dean's list, the whole thing. She laughed quietly. Guess life had other plans. The words hit him harder than they should have. In his world, dreams were investments, calculated risks with projected returns. But Ellie spoke about hers like they were living things that had died. It's not too late, he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Gary, I'm 28 years old, working retail and drowning in medical debt. When exactly do you think I'll find time and money for college? I could make it happen, he thought desperately. I could pay for your education, clear your debts, give you everything you've ever wanted. But Gary the trainee couldn't do any of those things. Gary the trainee could only offer what Grayson Hale had forgotten how to give, genuine human connection. My break's almost over, she said, standing up. But instead of leaving, she paused beside his chair. Gary? Yeah? Thanks for listening. I don't usually talk about this stuff. Her hand brushed his shoulder as she passed, and Grayson felt electricity shoot through his entire body. It was just a touch, innocent and brief, but it awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. That evening, as they restocked shelves in the quiet post-closing hours, their conversation drifted to safer topics, favorite movies, childhood memories, the kind of easy intimacy that develops between people who work side by side. You're different, Ellie said suddenly, arranging soup cans with methodical precision. Grayson's heart stopped. Different how? Most guys who work here are either trying to get in my pants or treating this like a prison sentence until something better comes along. She glanced at him sideways. You actually seem to care. Because I'm falling in love with you, he wanted to say. Instead, he managed, maybe I'm just a better listener than most. Maybe. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something clean and simple that cost a fraction of what his dates usually wore, yet somehow more intoxicating than any expensive perfume. Or maybe you're hiding something. The words were playful, but there was something searching in her eyes that made his chest tighten with guilt. We're all hiding something, he said carefully. True. She reached for a can on the high shelf, her body stretching in a way that made his mouth go dry. Without thinking, he moved behind her, his hand covering hers on the can, his chest nearly touching her back. For a moment, they stood frozen like that, her caught in his shadow, both of them barely breathing. He could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse where his fingers touched her wrist. Gary, she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. Slowly, she turned in the circle of his arms, her green eyes wide and uncertain. They were so close he could count the freckles across her nose, could see the tiny scar on her chin that probably had a story he wanted to hear. This is crazy, she breathed. Yeah, he agreed, his voice rough with longing. It is. But crazy felt right. For the first time in his carefully orchestrated life, something real and unplanned and absolutely terrifying was happening. And as Ellie's eyes fluttered closed and she leaned slightly toward him, Grayson realized he would trade his entire empire for the right to kiss her in this fluorescent-lit aisle surrounded by soup cans and lies. The moment shattered like glass when Vincent's voice cut through the intimate silence. Well, 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 what do we have here? Grayson and Ellie sprang apart, both of them flushed and breathing hard. Vincent stood at the end of the aisle, his smile sharp as a blade and twice as cruel. Fraternizing on company time? That's against policy, Brooks. You know better. We were just... Ellie started, but Vincent held up a hand. Save it. My office. Both of you. Now. The walk to Vincent's office felt like a death march. Grayson's mind raced, calculating damage control, exit strategies, anything to protect Ellie from the fallout of his deception. But as they sat in the cramped office with its flickering fluorescent light and stale air, he realized his options were running out. I've been watching you two, Vincent said, settling behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. The little coffee dates, the lingering looks, the way you've been covering for each other's shifts. Grayson felt Ellie tense beside him. This was his fault. All of it. Here's the thing, Vincent continued, his voice oily with satisfaction. Corporate's been asking questions about this location. Productivity, employee satisfaction, that viral nonsense about retail tiers. They want answers. Vincent pulled out a tablet and swiped through several screens. Funny thing happened yesterday. I got a call from someone claiming to be from corporate HR demanding that Brooks here get her full-time hours back. Except when I called to verify. He paused dramatically. No one knew anything about it. Grayson's blood turned to ice. So I did some digging. Ran some background checks. And you know what I found about our new trainee, Gary Miller? Vincent's eyes glittered with malice. He doesn't exist. Ellie's head snapped toward Grayson, confusion and fear warring in her green eyes. What's he talking about? Vincent laughed, clearly enjoying the moment. Go ahead, Gary. Tell her who you really are. Or should I? The room fell silent except for the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit. Grayson looked at Ellie, really looked at her, and saw the exact moment understanding began to dawn. The color drained from her face and her hands started to shake. Ellie, he started, his voice barely a whisper. Ladies and gentlemen, Vincent announced with theatrical flair. Meet Grayson Hale, owner and CEO of Hale Foods, your boss's boss's boss. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ellie stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find oxygen. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Is it true? Grayson wanted to lie, to keep playing Gary for just a little longer. But looking into her devastated eyes, he couldn't find the words. His silence was answer enough. Oh my God. Ellie stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward. Oh my God, you're him. You're the one who cut my insurance. You're the reason my mother almost... She pressed her hand to her mouth, backing toward the door. Ellie, please let me explain. Explain? Her voice cracked like a whip. Explain what? That you've been lying to me for weeks? That you watched me cry about my mother dying and said nothing? That everything between us was just... What? Research? No, that's not... I told you everything. Tears streamed down her face now, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, blazing fury. I told you about my dreams, my fears, my mother's illness. I trusted you. I was falling for you, and you're the enemy. Vincent watched the scene unfold with obvious delight. This is better than cable TV. Ellie spun toward him. And you knew and said nothing? I wanted to see how far this little charade would go. Vincent shrugged. Corporate espionage is a serious offense. I'm thinking we press charges. You're not pressing anything, Grayson said, his voice deadly quiet. For the first time since entering the office, he let his real authority show through. You're fired, Torres. Security will escort you out within the hour. Vincent's face went white. You can't. I own this company. I can do whatever I want. But as Grayson turned back to Ellie, he realized that all the power in the world couldn't undo the look of betrayal in her eyes. Don't, she whispered when he took a step toward her. Don't you dare come near me. Ellie, please. Yes, I lied about who I was, but everything else was real. What I feel for you, what we have nothing. Her voice was ice. We never did. You made sure of that the moment you decided to play dress-up in my life. And with that, she was gone, leaving Grayson alone with the wreckage of the first real thing he'd felt in years. 6 weeks had passed since that devastating night in Vincent's office, and Grayson had done something unprecedented in his corporate career. He'd stayed away. No surprise visits, no executive mandates, no attempts to use his power to force a conversation with Ellie. Instead, he'd done something far more radical. He'd listened. The first wave of changes rippled through Hale Foods within days of his return to corporate. Health insurance eligibility dropped to 20 hours per week. Wages increased across all positions. Paid sick leave became standard, not a privilege. The board called it corporate social responsibility. Grayson called it penance. But tonight, as autumn painted Dayton in shades of gold and crimson, he found himself standing in the parking lot of store 847, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Through the large windows, he could see Ellie at her register. Her auburn hair caught the store's fluorescent light, and even from this distance, he could tell she looked healthier, less exhausted, more present. The changes he'd implemented were working, but they felt hollow without her forgiveness. Taking a deep breath that tasted of possibility and fear, he walked through the automatic doors. The night manager, a kind woman named Patricia who'd replaced Vincent, nodded at him respectfully. Mr. Hale, she's been expecting you. She has? Patricia smiled knowingly. Some things can't stay broken forever. Grayson's legs felt unsteady as he approached Ellie's register. She was helping an elderly customer count out exact change, her patience infinite and genuine. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't flinch or flee. Instead, she held his gaze with those devastating green eyes. Mrs. Henderson, could you excuse me for just a moment? She asked the customer, her voice steady. Of course, dear. Take your time. Ellie stepped out from behind her register, and for a moment they simply stood there, two people who'd shared something real amid layers of deception. You changed everything, she said quietly. The insurance, the wages, the sick leave. Patricia told me it came from the very top. It should have been that way from the beginning. His voice was raw with honesty. I built this company on numbers, not people. You showed me the difference. Why didn't you try to contact me? Use your influence to force a meeting? Grayson managed a sad smile. Because Gary Miller would never have done that. And despite everything, Gary was the most honest version of myself I'd ever been. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. I was so angry, she whispered. For weeks I was furious at you for lying, for making me feel things for someone who didn't really exist. But he did exist. Grayson stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her green eyes. Every moment we shared, every conversation, every feeling, Gary was real. He was just the part of me I'd forgotten how to be. Tears gathered in her eyes, but these weren't tears of anger or desperation. They were tears of someone standing at the edge of forgiveness. My mother wants to meet you, she said suddenly. The real you. She says anyone who would anonymously pay for a stranger's medical bills and then disappear without taking credit must have a good heart buried somewhere under all that corporate armor. And what do you think? Ellie reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against his hand. The same hand that had bled from pushing shopping carts, that had learned what honest work felt like. I think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that falling in love with Gary Miller was the smartest thing I've ever done, even if it meant learning to love Grayson Hale too. And do you love him, I mean? She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her since that night everything fell apart. I'm getting there, but he's got some catching up to do. Gary set the bar pretty high. As the store hummed with quiet evening activity around them, Grayson realized that his undercover mission had accomplished something he'd never intended. He hadn't just discovered what it meant to work for Grayson Hale. He'd discovered what it meant to be human. And maybe, just maybe, he'd found someone willing to love both versions of himself. 2 years later, the nursing school graduation ceremony was held in a packed auditorium at Ohio State University, where families clutched flowers and cameras captured moments of triumph. In the third row, Grayson Hale sat beside a woman with oxygen tubes in her nose and eyes bright with pride. She did it, didn't she? Margaret Brooks whispered, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. My stubborn, brilliant daughter actually did it. She never stopped believing she could, Grayson replied, his voice thick with emotion as he watched Ellie cross the stage in her cap and gown, her auburn hair gleaming under the auditorium lights. When her name was called, Eleanor Brooks, graduating summa cum laude, the small section they occupied erupted in cheers. Grayson stood and whistled, not caring that he drew curious stares from other families. Let them wonder why the CEO of a major corporation was cheering for a former cashier who'd become a registered nurse. After the ceremony, Ellie found them in the crowd, her face radiant with joy and disbelief. She hugged her mother first, careful of the oxygen tank, then turned to Grayson with tears in her eyes. I can't believe it's real, she whispered against his chest as he held her close. You earned every moment of this, he murmured into her hair. Every late night studying, every clinical rotation, every time you thought you couldn't do it, you proved yourself wrong. The scholarship fund he'd established, no longer anonymous, had covered her tuition, but Ellie had insisted on working part-time throughout nursing school. Not at Hale Foods, though those doors remained open to her. Instead, she'd chosen a small clinic in a low-income neighborhood, saying she wanted to understand healthcare from the patient's perspective. That evening, they celebrated at a modest restaurant Margaret had chosen, the kind of place where the waitress knew your order and the pie was homemade. It was a far cry from the Michelin-starred establishments Grayson used to frequent, but he'd discovered that happiness tasted better when shared with people who mattered. So, Margaret said, cutting into her slice of apple pie with deliberate precision, when are you two going to make this official? Mom. Ellie's cheeks flushed pink. What? I'm 73 years old and on oxygen. I don't have time for subtlety. Margaret fixed Grayson with a steady stare. You love my daughter? More than I thought it was possible to love anyone, he answered without hesitation. And you're not going to break her heart with your rich boy nonsense. Grayson smiled. In the 2 years since that night in the store, Margaret Brooks had become his toughest critic and fiercest defender. She'd seen him at his most vulnerable. The night Ellie had pneumonia, and he'd sat in the hospital waiting room for 18 hours, or the morning he'd showed up at their apartment with groceries and dark circles under his eyes after working all night on new employee benefit packages. I promise you, Margaret, she's changed me in ways I'm still discovering. Good. Margaret nodded approvingly. Because if you hurt her, I may be old and sick, but I know where you live. Ellie laughed, the sound bright and free. I love you both, but can we please discuss something other than my love life? Actually, Grayson said, reaching into his jacket pocket, I was hoping we could discuss it just a little bit longer. Ellie's eyes widened as he pulled out a small velvet box. Not the massive diamond ring his wealth could afford, but something simpler, an emerald the color of her eyes, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the light like tears of joy. Ellie Brooks, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, you taught me that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold. They can only be earned through love, trust, and the courage to be vulnerable. Will you marry me? The restaurant had gone quiet around them, other diners pausing their conversations to witness this moment. But Grayson only saw Ellie, her tears, her smile, her trembling hands as she reached for his face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, but only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never stop being Gary, the real you, the man who pushed shopping carts and listened to me cry and loved me when I was broken. I promise, he said, sliding the ring onto her finger. Gary Miller was the best man I ever learned to be. As applause erupted around them and Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, Grayson realized that his greatest acquisition had never appeared on any balance sheet. It couldn't be measured in dollars or market share. It was measured in moments like this, in love freely given and gratefully received, in second chances and new beginnings, in the revolutionary discovery that true wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about who you chose to become. Outside, snow began to fall on Dayton, Ohio, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. And in a small restaurant where dreams came true over homemade pie, a former millionaire and a newly graduated nurse planned a future built on the solid foundation of authentic love.